Go ahead and you can put your finger in two places in the Bible. We're going to look at Genesis, we're going to look at Ephesians. So Genesis 2, Ephesians 5. Today we're going to speak to something in parallel to what you're doing in your DNA groups. We're working on really understanding idolatry and idols in our lives, which suffocate our relationship with God and confuse us in how to live. And we've been doing that through some of our discipleship material. I want to teach in parallel to that. We're also doing this up at our men's retreat, so I'm going to take a portion of some of the things that we shared. And the message will come in two different parts today. I want to give an overview about our devotion, God's requirement of our devotion to Him, but then also practical points of how to be able to discern idols in our lives. This is part one. I'm thinking we might have another part in the next coming weeks. The first thing I want to do is talk about marriage to God and married to God. Marriage is the first community that God created, and it's a metaphor, it's a picture of our devotion to Him, okay? Let's see, I want to make sure I have the right verses here. Great. I don't know about you. You know, when I was growing up, I always thought when we heard the word idols, and you tell me, you could just kind of wave your hand if this is true for you too. I always thought as idols as something that, they were these weird statues, and they were out in some jungle very distant from where I lived, and there were like slain animals and cats around. Of course, I always added cats because I'm not a big cat fan. Sorry, but there's slain animals and weird stuff and dancing and all kinds of stuff, and I thought that was very distant from my world. Okay, strange statues. Any of you experienced that too? Or you thought of that? When I grew up, we never really had teaching on idolatry that was common to us. We always thought that was back in the Bible or way out in some distant land of people who weren't didn't have as many schools or weren't as educated as we were, etc. And I'll tell you what, missing that kind of teaching really caused a lot of long-term trying to figure out how to walk well with the Lord, all right? How to discern the path to obey the Lord. And I told my kids as they were growing up, I was like, we're going to start early. We started just before middle school, and we were really starting to unpack this. And I told them, I didn't have this. You need this early to be able to discern what you're feeling, when you're feeling it, and why there's confusion in your heart, and how to obey God, because sometimes you get these obstacles in your life, or you get indifference, or you get cold or distant from the Lord, and you're going to need to know how to navigate that. And I want to be able to start teaching you this. And we all, let's just put it this way, we all are idol factories. You know, give us enough time by ourselves without thinking about Christ, and we'll just produce all kinds of different idols. And we'll grow them, we'll give space to them, and they'll grow in our lives, because that's our nature. Our nature is to look for something here, now, present, that can fill up this big ache in our hearts that really is for God, but we just don't even know it. So we all practice idolatry. The moment that we've sinned, we've practiced a form of idolatry. And so I know together I am an idolater as much as every one of you are in here. I don't even need to ask for you to raise your hand because I just know human beings are naturally idolaters, but God doesn't want us to be idolaters. God wants to dismantle these things in our lives. And as He begins the Bible, if you think about it, the Bible begins with a love relationship. A pure relationship. You have a husband, you have a wife. You have Adam, you have Eve, you have God, and Adam loves Eve, Eve loves Adam, Adam and Eve love God, God loves Adam and Eve. It's this pure, triune relationship. Heaven and earth, heaven, the lover from heaven loving those on earth, and the ones on earth, Adam and Eve, responding in love to God. And there's not a betrayal of that love. There aren't any idols in the garden. There's no betrayal there. If you ever have thought about it, the Bible ends with the same story. The Bible ends with a couple that is in love with God. And who is that couple? So you have God the Father, And then you have the final, if you will, ultimate couple. Who is the couple? Who's the husband? Jesus. Who's the wife? The church. And therefore, gathered around together in holy matrimony, celestial, if you will, heavenly peace, there's no more tears. There's no more fighting. There's no more tension. There's no more pain. There's no more suffering. There's no more regret. There's no more keeping score. There's none of that happens often in our relationships, in our marriage, before each other and before God, because there's no more idols. And that's how the Bible begins. That's how the Bible ends, because it's all about loving God. Idolatry in the Old Testament is often called adultery, because it's betrayal of the love of God. It's a very serious word, two serious words. The prophets use prostitution and adultery. It's that serious before God because he's so betrayed by our idols. The prophets also use the word wrath. And the word wrath, we often think of, I don't like that. I like a loving God. And God is love, but C.S. Lewis talked about if you carry that out, if you walk that out, and you come in and you say, I want a loving God, and then you go into the presence of absolute, powerful, pure love, you will be crushed by it. So you can get what you want, what you ask for, but it'll crush you. In other words, you will only see how hateful you are as a person, how criminal, how much you hate and are jealous and envious and critical of other people and judgmental of other people when you get in the presence of pure love. It'll make you loathe yourself and your very own life. And so God has wrath, and that's justice. And love and justice work together, and here's what he does. He doesn't hate you. He hates the things that he knows will destroy you. God's wrath activates when he sees a lie or an idol or something in your life that is blocking his love relationship with you, betraying his love relationship with you. He seeks to destroy that, not you. That's the wrath. So, in other words, you could say, I don't like God's wrath. You should like it because it's actually for your good. It's a loving thing that God does when he destroys idols in our lives, because he knows how much they will destroy us in our relationship with him. So, back to man and woman in the garden and how they were created. It was the first community. It was two different people. You see, Adam was not alone. If Adam had all the ability to reproduce in himself, and Adam had all the capabilities and all the character traits, then Adam could easily take all of that and figure, I'm God on earth, and he could rival God. What did God do when he took Eve from Adam, when he separated them? What did he do? He also separated the powers and the personalities and the character traits and all of his goodness so that we need each other. So that community together forms pure, unadulterated worship before the Lord. That's his goal. That's his beauty that he makes. Not that we would rival God, but we'd love him more fully. Not that Adam and Eve were to worship each other, but that together they would come and then worship their one creator. They were two worshiping the one. And it was to walk with him purely. Well, let's take a look at a couple of the verses. Verse 23 of Genesis 2. Then the man said, would you read in blue, the words in blue with me out loud? This at last, okay, let's start again. Words in blue. This only, stop. Only people who are colorblind, you're exempt. All right, back to the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. She will be called Isha because she was taken from Ish. Those are the Hebrew words there. Beautiful picture going on there. And actually, it's poetry. It's really neat. When Adam sees Eve, he breaks out into poetry. We often think about, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, I have. what was it like when the world was without sin and without idols, and when everybody got along, the two of them, all two of them, and when it was good? What was that like? You see? And we say, boy, our world is so much more complex, and our world is so much more hateful and so much more heavy. And you're right. But when we talk like that too, we often become hopeless. I want to start here with good news for you, and that is, because of the way that God made pure communion between man and wife, between husband and wife, and between him and humans, I want you to know that that was a picture of what he was going to do in Christ for us, and that we will experience, and even more, what Adam and Eve had in the garden. Because one day, if you're in Christ, you will live in a world that's without sin and competition and violence and hatred and idols too. That's our future. That's your destiny. So you can wonder, wow, what was it like in the Garden of Eden? Boy, it must have been so nice and so uncomplicated. Yes, but you will also experience that. And that is the love of our husband who is loving us and redeeming us. So when we come to this verse, Adam breaks out into poetry. He breaks out in pure poetry, and he is saying, there is one who is like me. Here is my counterpart that I can walk together with God. This is not a person that I worship, that I idolize. This is not my main cause. This is a person that also helps me in my main cause, and I help her in my main cause. Marriage is now a series of daily sacrifices so that I might worship God. That's what Adam declares. And then the next verse, Moses, as he writes this, he prophesies in this way. In fact, Adam just prophesied, and we'll see what he did when he did that in just a few minutes. But here, Moses, as he writes the reason why. Therefore, here's the reason why: a man shall leave his father, shall leave his mother, and he will hold fast to his wife. God instituted the first community in this way, and they shall become one unified flesh, or one unified actor. The idea of flesh is how they act out their lives together. There's a union there. There's a binding. That's why Jesus said, what God has put together, let no man tear apart or separate. And so here's a binding between the two. They shall become one flesh. Now, it's not an amalgamation. Okay? It's not where they're fused and you can't tell the difference between them. No. It's two distinct persons with all the different attributes of God put together, and you can see both of them operating with each other, and in that synergy and in that union, then comes the good worship before the Lord. That is a picture of heavenly love being practiced on earth in marriage. That's an incentive for marriage. They shall become one flesh. Well, they did, and they walked well together, and they were happy for a little while, until that one day when first Eve desired the fruit, and then Adam desired the fruit, but there was something more beyond that. It wasn't just the fruit, was it? Yes, Eve saw an object that was beautiful to her and that she wanted, but there was something more. It wasn't just the object, like, oh, I just want to so taste that I'm willing to disobey God. There was something beyond that. It was a lie. Satan had just, through the serpent, he had just told her a lie, saying that it's not the case that when you touch that fruit and you partake of it, that you will surely die. God's not telling you the truth. He's hiding something from you. What was it that he was hiding? Any feedback there? What was the lie that Satan told her to actually believe? That's right. God's holding back. He's not as good as he says he is, even though this whole garden is really lovely, yes. But he's still not as good as he says he is, because he doesn't let you choose your own destiny. The knowledge of good and evil, what's good for you and what's bad for you. He's holding something back. He's not as good. And Eve and Adam together, they looked at that fruit and they made an object. There's the first introduction of idolatry right there. here's an object that represented a power that was behind them. What was the power? To be like God, knowledge. And so they chose knowledge over life. They didn't go to the tree of life, which they could have eaten from. They went to the one that God said, don't eat from. And they chose knowledge over power. And sure enough, they brought sin and death into our world. That's our parents. Good job, Mom and Dad. So we continue, and the pure and beautiful marriage has fallen because there's idols now. And there's idols that continue. And in the first sons that are born, the idol grows, and we have our first murderer, right? He doesn't get the idol of approval and affirmation because he chose to worship God his own way. And what happens? He goes out and he kills his younger brother Abel. His name was Cain. And here's Eve. She's idolizing Cain. I've got a man. This has to be the Savior of the world. No, he was the first killer. He was the first murderer. And so the story goes on. And God comes and he looks, if you will, he's going to give Israel and the people of God, Abraham has the son that's promised, and the story's starting to unfold that Adam prophesied, that Moses was prophesying. The story's unfolding, and God's going to show human responsibility and human failure to be the bride who was devoted to the heavenly husband, okay? And here's how it went. Just a little bit of the biblical story before we go into the practical things. Remember I said the message will come in two parts. This is the first part. So God is forming his people. He's allowing the children of Israel to multiply in Egypt. Egypt is a polytheistic or worshiper country of many different gods, hierarchies of gods, wars, and other things between the gods. And here's Pharaoh. He says he's a god, and he's trying to keep the alliances and all of these ordered as the one God that they can see. And so here's the Israelites. Now, they knew about God. His name was Elohim, and Elohim was the God of great power, the great creator God, but he was also known as the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they lived 400 years before. So in a sense, Elohim was pretty distant, 400 years. They were learning about him, but they did not know him by his personal name. His personal name was Yahweh. They didn't know him by this devotion name. See, Yahweh is the name not just of power, but of simultaneous presence, past, present, future, living with you and loving and pursuing you, the personal presence and personal name of God, the covenant God, the marriage God. Okay, that's Yahweh. They didn't know him yet like that. And God has to do what? He has to send his representative, like a son, who prefigured Christ, and his name was Moses. He sends it into Egypt. First, he has to meet Moses out by Sinai, right? You know, at the burning bush. There's no garden. There's no tree to pick fruit from because it's on fire, okay? So he has to be there before the burning bush. There's thorns. There's hard ground. He says, take your shoes off. I want you to feel the desert where you're planted, because everything around you is to point you to me. There's nothing else you can depend on. I hold your life in place right here at this bush. Now, in 1 year's time, and he did to the day, bring my people back to me right here. Come back here. And he sends Moses on his mission, who goes into Egypt, leaves Sinai, goes into Egypt, draws the people of Israel out from under all of those gods, which they would have learned about and been tempted by Egypt's gods, because Egypt was the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful empire, and they attributed their power and their prosperity to the gods. And so it had been very tempting for Israel, not knowing a personal God, to worship these impersonal deities and these powers. But God says, I want to win you and I want to reveal my name to you. He tells Moses, tell Pharaoh, not only let my people go, but what was the reason to let them go? That they might come out to the desert and worship me. Just put in the word love. That they might come out in the desert and love me for who I am. okay? This is God's pursuit of people and purity. So he forms the people, he draws them out of the idolatry, he brings them 6 weeks on the journey through the Exodus in the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, passes them into the desert, not a garden, but into the desert. He brings them to Mount Sinai and he forms a covenant with them. And he gives them the 10 Commandments. When we look at the 10 Commandments, we often think, oh, God gives rules, so they have to do all these things. The rules are 10 words of grace. Because the way that God did it is he used the same words that are used in a wedding. Actually, they draw weddings. Even today, Hebrew and Jewish weddings are formulated after the time at Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, God marries a new people that he has formed. In other words, Israel was to take the place of the new Eve so that Moses, being the representative, could walk with the people before God, and God would place his presence in their midst, and they would have a sense, not necessarily of the garden, but in the desert of the dependency, and he would court them. He would teach them how to love him. It would take 40 years. And he would have to wean them off of their dependencies, off of their idols, and he would draw them to himself. And what did he do? He took care of them. Their clothes didn't wear out. Boy, isn't that great, moms? And especially when you're having to buy clothes like every 2 weeks because your kids are growing so fast. Or because they tear them up in the yard or outside playing. Their shoes didn't wear out. Every day he fed them. Millions of people every single day, wonderfully giving bread from heaven, cooking for them, caring for them. He even gave them a way to have their sins forgiven. He set up the tabernacle so that they could exchange their unrighteousness and have their sins pushed forward to a perfect sacrifice. It was wonderful. There was atonement that was built for them. He marries them. He gives them law because they didn't have law. He gives them grace. He empowers them. And then what does he do? He plants himself, his presence in the middle. By day it was a cloud that gave shade in the summer heat in the desert. And by night it was a warm pillar of fire that gave heat in the desert and light. It's like one author said, it was the 2 legs of God walking with the children of Israel through the desert day by day. So that they would come to worship and love him, right? And right after that marriage covenant at Sinai, what did they do? They committed adultery. They made what did they make? A golden calf or an idol. And they said, in place of that Moses who went up in the fire, we don't know what happened to him. We don't need to know what happened to him. We can have this. This, as Aaron put it, this thing that jumped out of the fire. We can have the young calf. Voila. I get the impression that Aaron was not a very good sculptor and he didn't have much time. And this is what happened. This is what came out of the fire. In fact, that's how he relays it to Moses when Moses comes down and says, what have you done? He says, it just come out of the fire. It just jumped out at me. It's a golden calf. And what is it? A calf like that was a leader. It was a god in Egypt, and they formed it after their past. They brought an idol from their past. It wasn't even a full-grown bull. It wasn't even mature. It was a young one, like a young nation. Now we can worship this, and this will be our intermediary. We'll pray to this, and this will lead us. Not Moses, not whom you sent. That's what we do often in idolatry too. We replace Jesus and all the things that he's obtained for us with something else, even something small, something good, something made of gold, something that we choose. We do that. And so the story goes on that God works with them through the desert, draws them to himself. They almost lost the relationship with God over that adultery. But finally, God relents and says, I will go with you. That's Exodus 32. The story continues. God goes with them 40 years from their disobedience later and their fear. And then finally, they go in the promised land and they have this great worship ceremony. And they kind of renew their covenant. And Moses preaches the book of Deuteronomy to them when they go in. Deuteronomy means a repetition of the law, to repeat the law. So he's preaching the law 40 years after it was given at Sinai. So it's like having a renewal of your wedding vows time, okay? A new marriage time. And they do that at the beginning of going in the promised land, and Israel says, yes, yes, whatever you say, we will do. Yes, yes, we love you, God. Yes, we love you, God. They get in the promised land, and then all of a sudden they're like, ooh, look at all these cool Baals that are around us. And then they start worshiping the Baals. There's Baals for crops, and there's Baals for ground, and there's Baals for fertility and for children and for power and for gold and for riches. There's Baals for everything, but then the Baals lead to other bad Baals. And very soon we start to see Israel, the bride of God, literally sacrificing her children because she's so suffocated by idolatry. The northern kingdom, the sister, oh, she's wayward. The prophets call her a great prostitute. She goes out, she's lusting after anything but God. Then the prophets come to the younger sister, Judah, the one whom God is saying, watch the example of your older sister, how she has gone, and be faithful to me, but they weren't. And the prophets plead with the fire and the burning love of God. God puts his words on their lips and in their hearts, and they can't not speak the words of God to others, to the people of Israel. They're burning. They have to get it out or die, is really what the prophet's call was in their mission. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and some others say, my people have forgotten me. Literally, replaced me. This was the cry of God's heart. The idolatry is so bad, they've not only betrayed me, but they've replaced me. Then he puts Hosea the prophet in his own place. And Hosea's wife goes after lovers and cheats on him over and over again. But Hosea still has to care for her, and so he takes for Gomer, his wife, and he's got to take care of the kids because he's a single dad because mom has left. See, he's in the place of God, and he's experiencing the pain and the agony of God, but he takes the daily bread, water, sustenance, and clothes, and he bundles them up, and he puts them on the doorstep of where his wife is staying the night, and with whomever is staying the night. She opens the door, Hosea says, and she looks out and says, oh, look what my lover has left for me, and gives credit now to the lover when it's actually God still taking care of his people. Do you see how bad this is getting? Do you see how horrible the actions of the bride of God are becoming? And the language of the prophets gets more and more graphic. And I know that we have younger people here. I'm not going to go there, but it does because it is so severe. And that's a call to us because in our walk, in our relationships with God, that's what lies will do. It will form us in, we have the same thirsts and desires and lusts as the people of Israel did. Why? They were humans, we're human. Works like that. Until one day, finally, the true Israelite, the true Israel himself, the groom from heaven. If you notice the verse here, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother. One of the patriarchs, these were primitive or early church fathers. He was writing and he said this, Jesus left his father from heaven. He followed this verse. So Adam and Moses were prophesying about Jesus. The true Israelite, the true groom from heaven, left his father and his mother. Who's his mother? The early church father said that was the New Jerusalem. He was there in Jerusalem. It was the womb of the city of God, the place of the presence of God. Jesus leaves the side of his father through the womb of his mother and comes down into our darkness. And he seeks out a bride for himself. But he has to pay for the bride because the bride has committed a lot of adultery and a lot of sin. And the bride, by way of God's law, deserves to be put to death. The sentence of death for the law that she has broken over and over again. But instead of death for her, he, the perfect groom from heaven, takes it on himself and he dies on the cross for the bride. This is what he did. He came down so that he could rise from the dead. So he falls into death and is crucified, but he rises again, and in that moment, he is able to make a new people. He pays the price and the penalty for the bride. So that, why? when he rises again, she can worship him again purely. There's this beautiful restoration. I have to pay the price to free you so you can love God. And he gives himself away for the bride so that they can become one flesh. In this verse. And that's the argument that Paul picks up on. And Paul uses the metaphor or the illustration of the first community of marriage to point to this fulfillment that we're going to see in Ephesians 5, verses 30 and 31. Take a look at Ephesians 5, verse 30. Look at what it says here. Very short verse. Because we are members of his body. And Paul is quoting from Genesis 2:23. At last, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This is a member of my body. Same essence. Paul is drawing us to this. Now, often when we read Ephesians 5, we think, oh, Paul is giving us good marital help. This is how the Bible will help us have good marriages. It is helpful. It is for good marriages, but that's not the scope of Paul's argument. The goal of Paul's argument is to say, if you can see marriage that's on the earth, and some of you experience it, or you watch it in your parents, or you watch it among friends, okay, then you can start to begin to understand the final heartbeat of God to make you his bride. Okay, that's Paul's drive when he comes to these verses. Let me say it this way. Marriage was created to be able only to tell the story of what God would do for his people. In other words, the earthly picture of marriage is the penultimate picture of the final marriage of heaven. It's the gospel. And every good marriage that walks before the Lord and sacrifices one for another and walks to seek to honor the Lord is actually dramatizing and acting out the role of what Jesus would do for humanity and how he would make a new bride. So the church becomes a new Eve. And Jesus is the last Adam. And that's why Paul says, hey, if Jesus is the final Adam, the new progenitor, the father of the human race that I've made, there's Jesus, then his bride has to be loved, but she has to be able to love him. I have to make them members of each other. And he pulls back Genesis 2:23, and he says, just like Adam said, and I want you to get a little bit of the picture and the feel of the passion of Jesus for us. And when he looks at his people, he looks at you and he looks at me, he sings over us. He has poetry over us. And he cries and he exclaims and he loves. And here's his passion. And he looks at us redeemed in the blood of the Lamb and he says, at last, finally, after all these centuries and all these millennia, a people who can love me and love God purely. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, essence of my essence, heartbeat of my heartbeat. Jesus cries over us. You see the beauty, that the love and the passion that God has for us. So when we live the gospel, Jesus ignites with praise and says, finally, look at the people that God has loved and that I came to die for and to pay her price for and exchange my life for hers. Finally, you are what I've made you and called you to be. This is beautiful from our husband of heaven. We are members of his body. But the very next verse, Paul says, he quotes from the very following verse back in Genesis 2, and it continues on. Look at, therefore, he says the very same verse in chapter 5, verse 31 of Ephesians. Here's the reason: a man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. Jesus wants union with his bride. There's the reason. Here's the reason why. That's why it was put in Genesis. Now it's being repeated here. And if you will all take a look in verse 32. I don't have it for the screen, but take a look at verse 32. The mystery is profound. In other words, it's so deep that from the Ancient of Days, God has made, if you will, marriage to show the love relationship and the purity that he wants between humans and God. In other words, God loves his bride, the church, but he wants his bride to turn around and love him too. He wants her to respond. Now, let's just pause. Take a look in your heart and reflect. How many times in a day and through the word does God call you? Do you hear his whisper? Or maybe it's grown so old, or maybe your heart is still cold, or maybe you've never actually walked with God, or it's become indifferent because it's been suffocated with idols and there's too many other voices of other lovers there, that you can't hear his call. But how many times a day does the Lord call us, and do you respond? That's what he wants. I give myself to you. I've responded to your need. You respond to my need. Love me back. And there's Paul's argument. The two become one flesh for the glory of God. And that leads us to the end of Revelation. You see, the book of Revelation is not about speculation about, all the different end times and all the different trumpets and seals and fires and dragons and all those other things. It is about the King who is redeeming his bride through suffering, because the book of Revelation says, if Jesus is going to be the true king, he can't be a true king unless he has a queen right next to him. And his queen is his bride. And you're his bride. Jesus will not relent until his bride is reigning with him. I don't know about you, but doesn't that just give you the chills? Doesn't that just give you so much affection for how much affection the Lord has for you? There's the Bible story. And in that, God wants a pure love that responds to the Lord and responds to him affectionately. It's kind for kind. Now, we can never give the quantity of love back to Jesus that he gave to us, but we can give the same kind. It's love for love. That's what God expects of us. But we can't if there's idols in our lives. You see, it's idolatry that comes in that ends up suffocating that love and destroys us. So what does it mean to be a Christian? It means that we are married to God. And if we're married to God, we really have to be careful and vigilant about what kinds of idols and lovers are calling to us in our own marriage with God and the church. Right? I hope I haven't lost you. I just taught you the whole Bible. Pretty good, huh? Let's go to some really practical points now. This is the second part of the message. I gave you that because I wanted you to see the passion of God. I don't want you just to analyze idols and miss the whole point. The whole point of analyzing and discerning idols in your DNA groups and here at church and at our retreats is simply this, that we would love God. I want to help you be more devoted and passionate about Christ and follow him and believe rightly about him. So I'm going to give you a few, actually 8 points. Are you ready? For those of you who love lists, you're just really excited right now. I can hear the cries of joy from within you right now. How to discern idols. Number 1, an idol is the main reason for why we do something wrong. You will find that in the book Counterfeit Gods. In the epilogue, it's a quote from Tim Keller. And he's saying, do an inventory. Look at the last places that you've sinned. And as you've done that, you can go underneath the sin and figure out why, and you can find your idol there. Because it motivates. Anytime we've done wrong, it's been not the fault of an idol. We make the idols. The question is, which one is it that we have listened to, followed, and given our lives to when we've done something wrong? Number 2, and this is important, an idol is usually an object. It's a person or a relationship or a cause that we have. We can see all 3 happening in the fall with Adam and Eve, right? Eve takes an object and she listens to the wrong person, Satan, and that was a lie. And she then takes and part of that object in disobedience to God with the wrong person for her own cause, and that was, I want more power. I want the knowledge of good and evil. You see? So she does all three. Let's break down a couple of these, just a couple examples. A person. What do we mean by that? I expected we would have a number of mothers here today. And we have been dealing in the past and recently with a case where a mother has suffocated, literally, the very identity and personhood of their child. Now their child is a young adult with about the mind of a 10-year-old and doesn't know how to be able to be an adult anymore because the mother she was more than a helicopter mom. She's a helicopter mom. She's a drone mom. She is a mantle mom. She is all over this kid. And I'm giving you this personal example because everything she was doing was for that kid, for that child, for that relationship, so that that child would rise up one day and say, you are my favorite and best parent. For moms, a lot of times it's like, we want our kids to come and say, you are a great and loving mother. And when we're seeking for that, the more we try to put them in place. Who's the one who gives us our affirmation? It's got to be God. The more that we try to reach that affirmation, we're asking our kids to become God for us, and they can't be, the less affirmation we're actually going to have because we're suffocating them because we just turned them into an idol. That's a person. For dads, it's a little bit different. For dads, often we want to be called the most fun dad on the planet. My dad was always the most fun because behind that, there's that recreation and good times and not just a mean and severe dad. It's almost a reaction. So we want that affirmation. Not all the time. And I know I'm painting with a broad brush, but that's what takes place when we idolize a person. You will have less of what you want. Some of you will say, I want a romantic relationship. Or I want a friendship that will fulfill me completely and totally. And the more that we do that, the more we suffocate the definition of friendship because we're not paying attention to God. We are focused totally on the other person. We've objectified them. We're actually reducing them. So when we talk about sexual idolatry, for example, we have at our retreat, when we talk about sexual idolatry, what happens is it's the taking of the image of another person and turning them only into an object. In other words, their physical body without the dignity of being a person inside. They don't have character traits, and they don't have talents, and they don't have qualities, and they don't have things that represent God. They're just an animal. That's what we do. We objectify. See, what we're doing is we're reducing humanity, and we're turning it into an object. That is where we can discern when there's an idol. All right? Because none of these things are bad. None of these things are bad in and of themselves. It's just when we turn them into ultimate things. We'll get to that in just a second. All right? So I just want you to know that if you want to find out where an idol is, look at your causes. Look at your greatest passions and pursuits and dreams. Look at the relationships you have and how much you're investing in those and how much, if they are, I do everything for my family. Look out, you're going to destroy your family. Let me repeat that. I do it all for my family. And that lets us hide behind something that we're going to use to destroy our family. No, I don't. I do everything for the Lord who guides me to care for my family and teach them about the gospel and how to love Him. Okay? There we are, dads. It's real quiet in the room right now. Am I touching on an idol? Is that why it's quiet? Because we use these words, but we mask things behind. Number 3, the statue or the image of an idol is not happening out in a jungle, but it's actually the last phase of what we have been projecting from our hearts and wants all along. When we finally obtain the object, the relationship, or the cause, or the level, or the rank, or the career, or those things, when we obtain it, that is what our hearts have been dreaming for all along. And they have sidetracked us to love those instead of loving God. It's just the last form of what's been the idol in our hearts. Number 4, an idol is usually a good thing that becomes an ultimate thing. We never do choose things that disgust us. Ooh, I'd really like to worship and dream about that. It's disgusting to me. It doesn't make sense. We always choose our best. That's why Israel chose the gold and the jewelry to make the golden calf out of. And that is a very big principle. So when we were talking to our guys, and we're looking at it, each of our pastors, as we were teaching, brought out the aspect that God created us to prosper and have success. But when we make success our ultimate cause, then we are practicing idolatry and we turn it into a bad thing. I was talking with I got to spend the time with our teenagers. So I had about 12 teenage boys walking through discerning these idols. And one of the things that we talked about, right? Javen, you can back me up. You were there. One of the things we talked about was the very moment when the good thing, like power, success, money, and sex, these are all good things that God created and put in us, how it can be used for good, when it becomes a bad thing in our lives. And that's when our young men were saying, you need to discern the moment when that takes place. When we got to the one about power, okay, Javen, not you didn't say this, so you're not out of it. It's all the other guys, okay, buddy? We got to the one about power. It's really interesting. We were talking about control, the desire to dominate. So God puts in us a desire to control and organize and to be ordered like Him and disciplined like Him for His glory. But there's a time and there's a moment. I asked the boys, when's that moment when you know you have an idol? When it becomes from a good thing to a bad thing? And we talked about how your voice starts to raise and you're going to dominate. And the majority of them said, it's usually when I get in an argument with my brother or sister. So you see, they're practicing idolatry even between siblings. In that sense, they know, here's a good thing that's becoming an ultimate thing. Instead of using my power to serve, I'm using it to dominate and control and to argue and fight and destroy. Okay? Number 5, an idol is something we allow space for in our lives that takes up more and more space as the idol grows. It will grow so much that it becomes our ultimate thing, that it suffocates our lives and then leads to death. All right? More and more space. Sometimes God speaks to us in a message and we cut the idol down, but we still leave its footprint, that we're nurturing. We just give it less space. But I just want you to know, sooner or later, that thing's going to grow back. It's just like a tree. It's going to come back. Number 6 there, as you see it, an idol can be detected by evaluating what we dream about when we're sitting still. There was an old English bishop a couple hundred years ago, if I remember correctly. He said, when we are sitting still, what we dream about is our religion, right there. I think he's right. What do you dream for when you're riding down the road, when you're in a train looking out the window? Moms, when you release your kids upon the schools and then you go back home and sit down and there's that cup of coffee and you feel just absolutely drained and wrecked and you're like, oh, I'm going to go into my happy place. What is that happy place? Discern it. When we're sitting still, if it's not the treasuring of Christ in the beauty and the blessings that He's given us, I can tell you right now, you're probably on a path to keep nurturing an idol that will finally distract you and pull you away from God. Number 7, an idol can be detected by what level we rise to defend something when someone asks us about it. An idol will never protect you. You always have to protect it. And so you put up your defenses, but it's the moment when somebody presses that button, at what level do you rise to defend it? Now you can detect, ooh, there's something behind this. Martin Luther said that the first commandment, do you guys remember what the first commandment was? Is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. He says, whenever we break any of the other 9 commandments or any of the other 612 commandments that are there, we always break the first one. The first one is have no idols. Or second one's have no idols. First one is love God purely, have no idols. Number 2, we always break that first one when we sin. What does he mean? You see, when we lie, we break the 6th command or the 6th commandment. You shall not lie. We break that commandment. What are we lying for? We're lying to protect an idol because we're loving that and we're not loving the Lord our God with all our hearts. So we've broken the first commandment too, you see? And so what happens is our defenses rise. I was talking with a brother at the retreat, and he said, you know what? I found one of the areas where my idol was because when I start to talk to my teenage sons, they come back and they've learned very quickly to come back and press on that one button. And the one button is, you are too over-controlling. You're a control freak. And when they say that, I blow up and they got me. My kids dominate me with that one button. And he said, that's my idol. Why? Because he's defending, if you will, he's not defending just being a dad. He's defending trying to control his own world for his own comfort all the time instead of showing them Christ. And he said, that's what I've been doing. And my kids see it and they just push the button and they know I'm going to blow because I'm defending my own comfort level. Still pretty quiet means I'm probably talking to a number of us as dads. We've been there before. We've experienced that. Number 8, as you see on the screen, an idol will always produce disillusionment in your life sooner or later. I'll end the sermon with this illustration. In the 4th chapter, I believe it's your 4th chapter of the book that we're working through, Counterfeit Gods, Tim brings out this aspect of cosmic disillusionment. All he's saying is, in every object, person, or cause in our world, God has imprinted limits on everything. And he allows us to go into something and experience those limits. When we hit the limit of something, then we get disillusioned. Years ago, in the 90s, I used to work at a car dealership, and I sold vehicles. And they told us, now this was in the 90s, this was Chevrolet, GM, they did a survey, and they found out from all their car owners that it only took, on average, about 22 to 26 months after somebody purchased a new car to be looking for another one. Well, that's really good for salesmen. Make sure you follow up with your customers after 22 months because they're probably in the market again. I'm guessing today, that's 30 years ago, I'm guessing today it's more along the lines of 2 or 3 months. Right? We get disillusioned fast because our world moves fast. That new car just isn't as new anymore. Why? Because we see other newer cars driving past us. We're like, ooh, that's nicer than this one. See, there's a limit to it. We just don't get the same joy out of it. Same thing with relationships, same thing with marriage. Oh, they're just not as nice as what it used to be. They're just not as affectionate as what they used to be. Thank you, Tom. Good. Tom gets 10 extra points today because he said the word better. Basically what happens is this. Tim was saying, the reason that God has imprinted disillusionment on everything is so that when you hit its limits, that you will experience the disillusionment with that, and you will turn to Him who is infinite and unlimited. He is full of love, He is unlimited, He is omnipotent, He is omniscient, and He is omnipresent. He is here for you, and He loves you. So allow yourselves to be disillusioned with things in this world so you can properly pursue Him. Let the good things be the good things. Don't turn them into ultimate things because He is the ultimate thing and He wants to be known as your ultimate cause, your ultimate joy. And He loves you that way. Amen?